On the night of Palm Sunday in the year 1212, an 18-year-old noblewoman would slip out of her family's house in Assisi in secret, never to return to that life again. The Church celebrates on this day, August 11th, Saint Clare of Assisi, virgin and abbess, whose feast falls on the very anniversary of her death in the year 1253. Born Chiara Affroduccio in 1194 into a noble Assisi family, Clare had already resolved, against every expectation placed on a young woman of her rank, to give her life entirely to God. That Palm Sunday night, she left home to join Francis of Assisi, who cut off her hair with his own hands and clothed her in a plain penitential habit. Together they founded the Order of Poor Ladies, later renamed the Poor Clares in her honor, and Clare governed the small convent of San Damiano as abbess for 42 years, living out a radical poverty she spent decades defending before Rome, finally winning the rare privilege of poverty from Pope Innocent IV, confirmed in writing only 2 days before she died. In 1240, when Saracen mercenaries stormed the walls of Assisi and reached the very gate of San Damiano, Clare, already gravely ill, rose from her sickbed and held up the Blessed Sacrament before the attackers, who tradition says fled in terror, the reason she remains patroness of Eucharistic adoration to this day. Centuries later, in 1958, Pope Pius XII named her patron saint of television, recalling how, too sick to attend Mass herself, she reportedly saw and heard the whole service as though it were projected onto her own cell wall. Clare's life teaches that a poverty freely chosen out of love can hold more courage than any army. 2 centuries later, in a Roman catacomb sealed for well over 1,000 years, workers would uncover a young girl's tomb and, without meaning to, launch one of the most debated devotions in the modern Church. Saint Philomena, virgin and martyr, is also honored on this day, August 11th. Her story begins on May 24 or 25, 1802, when excavators opened a tomb in the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome and found the remains of a young woman beside 3 broken tiles reading, Lumina Pax Te Cum Fi, rearranged to read, Pax Tecum Philomena, Peace be with you, Philomena, alongside a small vial then identified as a blood relic, a traditional sign of martyrdom. Moved in 1805 to Magnano del Cardinale in southern Italy, the relics quickly became linked to reports of miraculous healings, and popular devotion exploded. The now famous account of her life, a 13-year-old Greek princess who refused to marry Emperor Diocletian and survived a string of failed executions before her beheading, comes not from any ancient document, but from private revelations an Italian nun reported receiving in 1833, decades after the tomb was found, and should be treated as pious tradition rather than verified history. Even so, devotion was carried forward above all by Saint John Vianney, the cure of Ars, who called her, "my dear little saint," and built her a shrine, leading Pope Gregory XVI to authorize her feast in 1837 without a formal canonization. In 1961, Vatican scholars removed her feast from the Church's official calendar, concluding the identification was too uncertain to sustain a universal cult, yet she was never truly decanonized, since she had never been canonized in a strict sense, and devotion to her remains very much alive today, especially at Magnano. Philomena's story teaches that a soul's power to draw hearts to God doesn't always wait for documents to catch up. Going back further still, to the age of the Roman persecutions, a young woman's refusal to marry into the emperor's own family would cost her her life on this very day. Saints Tiburtius and Susanna of Rome, 3rd century martyrs, share a joint memorial on August 11. Tiburtius was buried along the Via Labicana, in the cemetery now known as the catacombs of Saints Marcellinus and Peter, a distinct figure from the better-known Tiburtius linked to Saint Cecilia, whose own feast falls on a different date, a mix-up hagiographers still have to untangle given the identical name. Susanna, meanwhile, was the daughter of the Roman priest Gabinus and niece of Pope Caius, both likewise venerated as saints. Tradition remembers her as a young woman of notable beauty and piety who flatly refused to marry a relative of Emperor Diocletian, a refusal that led to her beheading around the year 295. No trial records survive for either martyr, a common gap for saints of the great Roman persecutions, but both appear consistently across the Church's oldest martyrologies, evidence of a cult reaching back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. The very house on Rome's Quirinal Hill where Susanna reportedly lived and died later became the titular church of Santa Susanna, still an active parish today, famous for its Baroque facade, and one of the most direct surviving links between a Roman martyr and a building still standing in the city. Tiburtius and Susanna's witness teaches that a single refusal, grounded in conviction, can outlast an empire that thought itself eternal. Crossing the sea to 5th century Ireland, a young noblewoman would defy her own family to found a house of prayer at a crossroads where 7 roads met. Saint Attracta of Ireland, also spelled Athract or Arot, is remembered on this same day, August 11th. A contemporary of Saint Patrick himself, she received the religious veil directly from him, according to Tyrcan, author of the Book of Armagh, one of the oldest and most reliable sources on the Christianization of Ireland, a genuinely well-documented detail, even if later biographies written centuries afterward added considerably less verifiable embellishment. Born into a noble family in County Sligo, Attracta resisted her family's opposition to her religious calling and fled to South Connaught, establishing her first monastic foundation at Drumconnell near Boyle in County Roscommon before finally settling at Killarat, beside Loch Garra, at that crossroads where 7 roads converged. There she founded a convent alongside a hospice for travelers, a work of charity that drew a village to grow up around her oratory, one that reportedly still stood as late as 1539. She's remembered for her constant charity toward the poor and toward travelers, and for healings attributed to her intercession, and is venerated today as patroness of the Diocese of Achonry in the west of Ireland. Attracta's life teaches that hospitality offered without condition to the stranger on the road is itself a lasting form of holiness. Turning back to the mountains of central Italy, a bishop would be put to death simply for holding the office he held, at a time when emperors had begun hunting church leaders by name. Saint Rufinus, Bishop of the Marsi, is also honored on this day, August 11th. He led one of the small, vulnerable Christian communities scattered around Lake Fucino, in the region then known as the Marsi, and was martyred together with several companions during the reign of Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who ruled from 235 to 238 and became notorious for targeting Christian clergy specifically, unlike earlier persecutions that had struck more broadly at ordinary believers. At a time when Christianity enjoyed no legal protection anywhere in the Roman Empire, Rufinus's execution fits a wider pattern of localized persecutions aimed squarely at church leadership during Maximinus's brief and violent reign. As with many bishops martyred in the Roman provinces of the 3rd century, no reliable trial record of his arrest and death survived, and what we know of him today comes largely from his consistent presence in the Church's ancient martyrologies, evidence, historians argue, of a local cult established close to the events themselves, even without the richly detailed narratives preserved for martyrs from larger cities like Rome. Rufinus's life teaches that faithful leadership, even when history preserves almost nothing of the details, can still leave behind an unbroken cult of memory. Centuries later, in Merovingian France, a monastery's own abbess would be arrested on a charge of treason serious enough to cost her life. Saint Rusticula of Alls, also known by her baptismal name Marcia, died on this very day, August 11th, in the year 632. Born around 556 into a wealthy family in southern France, she was abducted while still a child and brought to the Abbey of St. John of Alls, where she became a nun and, remarkably young, abbess starting in 575, a post she held for nearly 6 decades. According to a biography written shortly after her death by a priest named Florentius, a source close enough in time to lend it real credibility, Rusticula reportedly memorized the entire Bible and wore a hairshirt beneath her habit as a constant act of penance. In 613, amid the political chaos that followed the fall of the Merovingian queen Brunhilde, she was arrested and accused of plotting against King Clothar II, a charge grave enough to have cost her life. Investigated and cleared of any wrongdoing, she was released and resumed governing her monastery until her death on this same date in 632, at an advanced age by the standards of her time. Her remarkably long tenure at the head of the abbey, surviving decades of Frankish political instability without ever losing her position, remains one of the most striking aspects of her story. Rusticula's life teaches that a falsely accused conscience can be patient, and still be vindicated in the end. On this same day, in what is now northern France, a bishop would spend nearly 40 years quietly turning still pagan villages into lasting Christian communities. Saint Jerry of Cambrai, also known as Gagericus, is remembered on August 11th, the date traditionally given for his death in the year 619, though some sources place it in 626. Born around 550, Jerry served as Bishop of Cambrai for close to 4 decades, at a time when the region was still slowly being Christianized among rural Frankish populations that remained partly pagan. He's remembered for founding churches and monasteries that helped establish a lasting Christian presence in the area, including the Church of St. Medard in Cambrai, where he himself was later buried. That church, rebuilt and expanded over the following centuries, is known today as the Church of St. Jerry in his honor, and remains the main sanctuary associated with his memory in the city. His feast already appears recorded in the martyrology compiled by the Benedictine monk Rabanus Maurus in the 9th century, one of the earliest major organized compendiums of saints' lives from the Middle Ages, a sign of a cult well established only a few centuries after his death. Jerry's life teaches that patient, unglamorous groundwork, one church, one community at a time, is exactly how a whole region's faith gets built to last. Meanwhile, further south in Italy, a layman with no ordination at all would be trusted with a moral authority that made Rome's own clergy uneasy. Saint Equitius, abbot, is also celebrated on this day, August 11th, born around 490 in the Abruzzo region of central Italy. He lived first as a hermit before founding a monastery in the Valeria district near Terni, becoming one of the central figures in the spread of monasticism across central Italy during the 6th century, a period when monastic life was still taking hold outside major centers like Rome. Despite his widely recognized spiritual authority, he preached and counseled the faithful across the region, and is said to have been investigated by Roman ecclesiastical officials suspicious of a layman wielding such influence and preaching ability without ordination. Equitius was never made a priest, a genuinely unusual feature for a monastic founder of his era. What we know of his life comes chiefly through the dialogues of Pope Gregory the Great, written decades after Equitius's death in 570, one of the most respected hagiographical sources of the early Middle Ages precisely because it comes directly from the pen of a pope who had himself been a monk before the papacy, lending the account a credibility many other saints' lives from the period simply lack. Equitius's life teaches that genuine holiness doesn't wait for a title before it starts doing good. And we close today's journey, August 11th, on the coast of Roman Gaul, where a missionary bishop would spend decades uprooting pagan practices that had outlasted the arrival of Christianity itself. Saint Taurinus of Evreux, first bishop of that city, is honored on this same day. Born around the year 350, he first worked as an evangelist in the Milan area of Italy, according to Norman tradition, before becoming, around 385, the first bishop of Evreux in northern France, a post he reportedly held until his death in 412. Though some modern historians consider that chronology too early for the ecclesiastical organization of the region at the time, suggesting he may actually have lived a century or more later, a dating uncertainty worth stating honestly, since much of his biography was only put in writing centuries after his death. Tradition holds he worked hard to root out pagan practices still deeply embedded among the recently Christianized population of Normandy, and he's remembered for healing miracles attributed to his preaching. Over time he became one of the most venerated patrons of the city of Evreux, which still preserves shrines and reliquaries dedicated to him, and his feast continues to be marked locally with processions across the Normandy region today. And with that, we close the story of today's 9 saints and blesseds. If any of these lives touched your heart, subscribe here to Saint of the Day. Comment asking for one of their intercession for someone you love. And most of all, share this video, because every time you pass along a story like this one, you're not just sharing a video, you're evangelizing, carrying the faith to someone who might need exactly this message today. And remember, the full prayer to each of them is right here in the video description.